So I wanted to speak about what is the absolute versus absolutism. So when we awaken to the miraculous nature of enlightened awareness, our perception of reality changes in a very particular kind of way. We awaken to and become aware of what they refer to in Mahayana Buddhism as the two truth doctrine. And the two truth doctrine tells us that that the sum totality of reality, that all of reality is made up of two levels, of two distinct levels and two distinct dimensions of reality. One is relative, and the other is absolute. There's relative reality and absolute reality, and they're definitely not the same. So it's only when we actually have the experience of awakening to non-relative or absolute reality do we begin to perceive and recognize the significance of the distinction between absolute reality and relative reality. They're two different dimensions of what is that are vastly different and almost completely unrelated, even though, of course, they are related because all is one and one is all. But what happens when we become aware of these two dimensions of reality is we begin to see almost all of our experience of relative reality as part of a paradox with absolute reality. We see everything as a dance between the relative dimensions of reality and the absolute dimensions of reality. We see both simultaneously, and each reflects upon the other in very unique and interesting ways. It's a very particular kind of consciousness, capacity for consciousness, and capacity for cognition, knowing and understanding that is very particular. So I wanted to speak a little bit about I speak about these distinctions all the time, but so I wanted to continue to speak about these distinctions for this talk. And particularly, I wanted to make a distinction between the recognition, experience, consciousness, and cognition of that which is absolute, and the dangers of what's called absolutism. And we know that human beings are very susceptible to absolutism. And absolutism is always a bad idea. And it's very weak-minded human being. Those of us who are weak-minded are easily tempted by the allure of absolutism. And absolutism basically means that the way you see reality, the way you perceive the reality, the way you think about reality is absolutely right and absolutely true and flawless and perfect. And we know that Eastern and Western religions have been and continue to be plagued by absolutism. They have been throughout history and continue to be plagued today by absolutism, as we also get plagued by absolutism in politics. So absolutism means my way of thinking, my way of knowing, my way of understanding, my way of interpreting reality is absolutely the truth. And anything other than my way of seeing, my way or our way of understanding and seeing reality is less than the absolute truth, is wrong compared to my way of seeing and our way of seeing. So absolutism is very tempting, because if you feel that your way of seeing is the absolute right way, and you're seeing things absolutely clearly as they truly are, and no one else is, or the others, your group is and the other group is not, it makes you feel very powerful and very special and very important. So when our capacity for consciousness and cognition begins to develop and deepen and evolve and complexify, we begin to understand that in terms of relative reality, relative consciousness, and relative cognition, everything's relative. Nothing, we can't see anything from a relative perspective as it truly is. From the perspective of multiplicity, we can't see anything as it truly is. All we have is relative perspectives. And we can maybe gain many different relative perspectives on one issue or one object. But there's no such thing as an absolutely perfect perception of any relative object. Now, the difference between relative and absolute in this context means that in terms of absolute versus relative, the perception of the absolute, the consciousness and the cognition of the absolute is the consciousness and cognition of non-duality or of a singularity or of a oneness. So in the consciousness or cognition of that which is absolute, there's only one and not two. There's no this and that. There's no different vantage points in the absolute. There's only one. And when we see only one, that's all we see. And the absolute, in terms of any way we define it, is a singularity. In that which is absolute, there's no duality. There's not two or three or four or five or 10 or 100 or 1,000 or a million. There's only one. However we define it, there's only one and not two. And we'll speak more about this, but that which is absolute is a singularity. Always and only a singularity. That which is absolute. If there is an absolute, which is a metaphysical definition of the God principle, who and what God is, then that absolute principle is a singularity, is singular, always singular, and only one. It's never seen in light of any other object or any other truth or any other dimension to reality. It's simply itself in its totality, in its overwhelming totality and completeness. So that which is absolute is always a singularity, whereas relative reality is always a multiplicity. It's the difference between the one and the many. So in the manyness, we see all the many different objects, thoughts, feelings, impressions, objects that make up the universe. We see the multitude of things that make up the evolving universe that we're all find ourselves in the midst of. And in terms of this multiplicity or relative reality, everything is relative. There's nothing that is absolute. In terms of relative reality, nothing is absolutely true. Nothing's in terms of relative reality, relative consciousness, relative cognition. Nothing is absolutely true. All truths in terms of relative reality are partial. And this is a very deep and profound recognition. And we begin to see that the nature of relative reality is manyness and partialness. There's no such thing as any absolute truth in relative reality. Everything is part of a process that's in progress. Everything's changing all the time. Relationships are changing and shifting. In this multiplicity, in this infinite world of multiplicity, the relative reality, everything that exists is affecting everything else that exists in multiple levels, most of which can't even be seen. So it's like living in a complex ocean of shifting sands and shifting relationships that's constant and unbroken. And what seemed to be relatively true one moment has changed in the next moment and shifted. So there's nothing that's absolutely true in the complexity of relative reality. Everything is relatively true. Something can be more relatively true and less relatively true, but nothing is absolutely true. So what happens when we awaken to enlightened awareness, which is the consciousness and the cognition of the presence of this mysterious, inconceivable, undefinable singularity, is that in the conscious recognition of this absolute singularity, we suddenly recognize the relative nature of relative reality in a whole new way. Because if all we're conscious of is the relative world of relative reality, we can't see how relative it truly is, as we can when we awaken to the absolute dimension of reality. And in light of this, we awaken to this absolute dimension of reality, which is this unimaginable singularity. So we suddenly see relative reality in all its relative nature. In a way we can't possibly see the relative nature of relative reality from within the matrix of relativity. It's only when we transcend the matrix of relativity altogether, which is the vantage point of absolute reality, that we can begin to see how relative reality is. Forgive me for repeating myself so many times, but I don't know how else to speak about this delicate topic. So if we're interested in the freedom of enlightenment, in the undeniable, unimaginable, glorious liberation of absolute reality, which is what the Buddha was pointing to, we become very interested in having the direct experience of this mysterious singularity that sets us free, and that releases us from the bondage of relativity. And there's various ways we can approach this kind of experience, but that's the way home, or the way to awaken to the consciousness of nirvana. It's by seeking to awaken this transcendental, by seeking to awaken to this transcendental singularity, so we can have our mind and heart blasted wide open in such a way that it'll never return to the way things were before. So that which is absolute, the singularity, this is what's important about it. What's important to understand is this absolute singularity. When we awaken to it, when we become conscious of it, it can be utterly overwhelming in its vastness and limitless nature. Because everything that we can see, taste, touch, smell, see, understand, in relative reality has a beginning and an ending. Relative reality is made up of countless billions of beginnings and endings. In absolute reality, there's no beginning and there's no ending. There's no beginnings and there's no endings. And so if we're used to living in a small self, ego-centered, personal context of consciousness and self, where everything is relative and everything has beginnings and endings, when we begin to awaken to the singularity in which there's no beginnings and there's no endings, we awaken to an eternal presence of some mystery that is not relative, but that is absolute. It changes everything, and it can be utterly terrifying, enthralling, intriguing, amazing, mesmerizing, but very intimidating, because the eternal nature of the absolute is unqualifiable and cannot in any way conform to our less than fully liberated mind's needs about the nature of reality. When we awaken to this absolute principle, in which there's no beginning and no ending, the only plausible way to respond is to submit, because there's nothing else to do in light of the enormity of the eternal nature of the absolute. All we can do is submit, because the difference between relative reality and absolute reality is relatively real. It's real, but it's only relatively real. Whereas absolute reality is real, but it's absolutely real. So there's a difference between that which is relatively real and that which is absolutely real, because that which is relatively real is not as real as that which is absolutely real. And I know it might sound like a small distinction, but it's not a small distinction. It's forgive me for saying so, but it's an absolute distinction. So that which is relatively real is suddenly recognized to be merely relatively real in light of the discovery of that which is absolutely real, which is recognized to be absolutely real. So when you awaken to that which is absolutely real, in a similar way to what I've been describing, you suddenly see, oh, I see that relative reality is only relative, but absolute reality is absolute. So it has more substance, it's more real, has more truth, more substance. Yeah, it's more real. So which world are you living in? Which world are we living in? Which world do we want to live in? A world where we are living, where we're in touch with that which is absolutely real? Or are we merely swimming around in a sea of relative truth and relative reality, that which is merely relatively real? That's something worth thinking about. So without the consciousness and the cognition and the recognition and the experiential discovery of that which is absolutely real, there's no enlightenment. Enlightenment is always only about that, the awakening and the experiential recognition of that which is absolutely real. But we have to remember that, and yeah, so therefore the presence of this absolute dimension or this God principle changes everything forever, and it's the source of liberation and emancipation. But we have to remember, and this kind of experience can be very inconceivably empowering in terms of giving us a sense of confidence, what I call spiritual self-confidence. It can be overwhelming, the sense of power and clarity and certitude that it can bestow upon us. It's amazing. But we have to be careful. We have to be careful about never allowing ourselves to believe that anything that is merely only relative is absolute. Because we need this absolute dimension to stay in its own context, in its own world. We to repeat what I'm saying, we have to remember that that which is relative is always only merely relative, and the only thing that's absolute is the absolute itself, not anything that can be distinguished separate from it. So the absolute is indeed absolute, and we have to allow it to be in its own category, which is ungraspable and ultimately undefinable by the relative mind. So we have to let the absolute abide in its own context and leave it alone. Allow it to inform and illuminate our mind and our consciousness and our souls, while refusing to draw any conclusions about relative reality in relationship to it. So we have to be aware of absolutism, which, to repeat what I was saying earlier, means I'm right, I'm absolutely right, and you're absolutely wrong. Because in relative reality, this just is never the case. As I'm just repeating what I said before, that in relative reality, everything is relative and partial. Just because everything is relative and partial doesn't mean it's not important. Or there are not different kinds of distinctions that we can make in terms of significance, in terms of what's more relatively true or less relatively true. That which is more relatively true has greater significance than that which is less relatively true. But still, that which is more relatively true is still only relatively true. It's not absolutely true. So we have to be very careful in our experience of consciousness and cognition and perception and distinction making and position taking. We have to be very, very careful, because we don't want to make so many mistakes that realizers and inspired religious people have made throughout the ages and can continue to make today. That which is merely relative is always only that which is merely relative. And to repeat what I just said, just for clarity, some relative truths have greater truth than other relative truths, but they're still, in the context of the relative truths, they're still only relative, not absolute. So the absolute is a different context. It's its own context of reality. It can't really be compared to anything else, because it exists in a different dimension. It transcends and includes everything else that we can imagine, or we can experience, or we can even begin to describe. But in what I'm calling relative reality, there's no such thing as absolute truth. So we have to be very careful that, that we make sure that as long as we're dealing in relative reality, there's no such thing as absolute truth, while recognizing there is such a thing as absolute truth, or the absolute, which exists always in its own context. So the absolute truth exists always in its own context, but that context needs to be left alone. And we never want to make the terrible and most dangerous mistake of confusing relative reality and relative truth with absolute reality and absolute truth. So we can fall in love with the absolute, and if we're lucky enough to awaken to the absolute, we have the courage, we can bear witness and proclaim that the absolute truth and absolute dimension to reality exists and is experienceable. And what's great, and we can proclaim that what the greatest realizers of history declared was absolutely real. It actually exists, and they were right, and they were honest, and they were truthful. They were calling all of us to the same realization. We can do that, and we can do so with confidence and conviction and passion. But to continue to make the fundamental point I'm trying to make, we must never confuse the fact that absolute reality is realizable and attainable with the relative nature of relative reality. We never want to confuse these two, and we want to be very careful about calling anything absolute except the absolute itself. And this is the big challenge for us. There are many very intelligent, sophisticated, philosophically minded people who have spiritual interests but are very suspicious about anything absolute, including the absolute itself. And I feel bad for them, because they don't know that the absolute, they have not yet had the kind of experience which would convince them that the absolute exists unconditionally and absolutely on its own terms. When we realize that for ourselves, it sets us free. But we want to be responsible if we're lucky enough to have this kind of realization, and we become stabilized in this kind of realization. We want to be careful. I realize I'm repeating myself over and over again, but I don't know how else to make this an important point. So please bear with me. That we can't confuse this non-relative absolute context or conscious experience and any other nature of relative reality. We don't want to confuse these two contexts. We want to leave them in their own context and not confuse them. So we want to resist the temptation to see anything that's merely relatively real as being anything other than relatively real. So absolutism is it's a very dangerous road to walk down, and it leads to violence and to madness and to wrong choices that lead to enormous suffering and delusion. So we have to be aware of absolutism, and many people who are aware of the dangers of absolutism, unfortunately, feel wary not only of absolutism but of the absolute itself. This is part of the problem. Because many smart, intelligent people are very afraid of absolutism, understandably and reasonably and rationally. There is an unnecessary skepticism and fear about the absolute itself. We mustn't confuse those two either. The absolute exists, but just because the absolute exists, and because we have had the good fortune to experience it and to know it and to experience liberation as a result, we still have to resist the temptation and exuberance that can be so compelling by becoming an absolutist. And because in relative reality, everything is partial and relative, absolutism doesn't make any sense. It's only relative reality. And therefore, to repeat what I was saying before, in relative reality, there's relative truth. And some relative truths are more true than others. So some relative truths have greater truth than other relative truths. But that doesn't mean, but that doesn't leave any room for absolute truth. I hope I'm being clear. I don't know if I am. I'm trying my best. This is delicate stuff. In postmodernism, very sophisticated postmodern thinkers find any notion of anything absolute as being inherently terrifying. because I'm repeating what I was saying a few minutes ago, but they feel that that any mention of that which is absolute is yet another form of absolutism, which is inherently dangerous. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that's true at all. We can have an intimate knowledge, experience, and understanding of the nature of that which is absolute without succumbing to absolutism, declaring that the absolute exists and is the deepest dimension of reality, which is called non-duality, doesn't inherently in any way imply that we're absolutists. So it's a delicate balance that we have to learn how to practice and to engage with. Because absolutism can sneak into a sensitive, intelligent person's mind and cognitive process without them even knowing it. So this is why, for example, most enlightenment teachers and also philosophers will always caution us about being too sure of anything, and about the need to always be more interested in what we don't already know than what we do already know. To always leave enormous room inside ourselves for what we don't know and for what's not obvious to us. So as a way to protect ourselves from absolutism, and this is something, as many of you know, I repeat very, very often, we need to leave enormous room inside our consciousness and experience of cognition. We have to always leave enormous room inside ourselves for what we don't already know. We have to always leave enormous room inside ourselves for what we do not already know. And this can help to protect us from even subtly becoming an absolutist without even being aware of it. Now, the temptations of absolutism are many, and it's obvious because absolutism as a metaposition in relationship to concepts, ideas, beliefs, and truths, real or imagined, relieves us of insecurity. If you feel you know something that's absolutely true, if you feel you're absolutely right, it frees you from the insecurity of not being sure. And it takes a very spiritually mature, strong adult to be able to resist the temptation, to be asked to see themselves as being absolutely right, or to believing in their own certainty with a little bit too much certainty. So the question here would be, how can we develop spiritual self-confidence without the dangerous certainty of absolutism polluting our consciousness and our cognition? And that's not an easy thing to do. Especially if we have powerful spiritual experiences, they can easily make us drunk on our own certainty. And this can pump up the ego and it must make us feel very powerful and sure of ourselves. Too powerful and too sure of ourselves. And then we can begin to make all kinds of mistakes in the way we are interpreting our reality, interpreting our own experience. Because in terms of relative reality, which let's be perfectly honest, is the world that most of us live in 99% of the time. In terms of our relationship to relative reality, it's very difficult to be absolutely sure of anything. Isn't it true? In relative reality, which is the world that most of us live in 99% of the time, if we're brutally honest and if we're smart, sensitive, and perceptive, if we're smart and perceptive minds, we're actually really paying attention to the nature of reality as it unfolds in this really relative context. We can see that it's very difficult to be absolutely sure of anything. We can be relatively sure of all kinds of things, but we can't be absolutely sure of anything. And if we know we can't be absolutely sure of anything except that the absolute exists, then we'll be in much better shape. We'll be spiritually and ethically and philosophically in a much more trustworthy place. So in a sense, what we would, in terms of everything I'm saying here, what we would aspire to is an absolute confidence that the absolute exists because we've experienced it or are experiencing it, however you want to put it. So we want to cultivate this absolute spiritual self-confidence in the nature of the absolute from our own experience, while being absolutely unsure about everything else. we can be relatively sure of all kinds of things, but absolutely sure of absolutely nothing, except that we're going to die one day. But besides that, we want to leave the door wide open. We don't really know. We could be right, we could be wrong. We could be on the right track or we could be misguided. But of course, all of us, if we have integrity, if we have moral and philosophical and spiritual integrity, we want to do everything we can to try and ensure that we're on the right track, going in the right direction for the right reasons. But there's no way to be absolutely sure, is there? And we want to have enough spiritual self-confidence to be able to endure that kind of absolute insecurity while not falling apart. Most of us are very crude-minded in the sense that we can't bear too much insecurity without falling apart and losing our way. So do we have enough spiritual self-confidence and enough self-confidence, period, to be able to embrace the radical nature of insecurity that's necessary in order not to get lost in absolutism, while at the same time having deep confidence in the nature of the absolute itself? And that's the hard work to be done. That's, I think, what a lot of spiritual practice would want us all to be aspiring to and what would want us all to put into practice. And so there's a beautiful paradox here. If I hope I'm making sense to all of you, I hope I'm not being too difficult to follow, but okay, I hope you can appreciate there's a beautiful paradox that I'm trying to share, which is the outrageous, audacious paradox between absolute spiritual conviction in the nature of God, to use crude language. God exists unequivocally and absolutely, doubtlessly, and we know that she is more real than anything else ever could be, always and forever. We don't doubt that. We're absolutely sure of it. And everything else except her reality, her truth, that reality, that truth, is to be viewed with suspicion and skepticism, always, no matter what. Is what I'm experiencing, is what I'm feeling, is what I'm thinking, are the conclusions that I'm drawing true? Are they as true as they seem to be? Or am I deluding myself? Are there gross and subtle distortions that are interfering with my ability to proceed to see clearly that I'm not aware of? Or am I so awake that I'm able to pretty clearly see them and conclude them in my experience of perception? We don't know. There's no way any one of us can be sure that we're seeing anything clearly anyway. There's no way we can be absolutely sure. We can think we are. We can believe that we are. We can hope that we are. And I would encourage us to hope that we are. We all want to hope we're seeing things clearly. God help us all. We hope we want to see things clearly, but there's no way to be absolutely sure. So if we know there's no way to be absolutely sure, if you know without any doubt that there's no way to be absolutely sure, it can give you the inspiration to make that extra effort to check up on yourself and to look again at your own conclusions, to look again at your own strong feelings, strong beliefs, strong ideas. You might be right. You might be very accurate, right on the ball, but you might not. We might not. And this is always true. It's always the case. Remember, in relative reality, everything's changing all the time. Nothing is static. Like the Buddha said, everything's changing. So in relative reality, everything that exists is affecting everything else that exists. In relative reality, everything is changing and shifting, changing and shifting, changing and shifting, and moving. So what seemed to be true one moment is not true in the next. And in the next and in the next moment, it's not the same, it's not as it was before. So in relative reality, everything's always changing, moving, and shifting. And we can't ever be sure that we're seeing everything absolutely clearly, anything absolutely clearly. But do we have to, in our experience of consciousness and cognition, are we simply lost in a sea of relativity, which would be, in my understanding, similar to what it is to be lost in samsara, lost in ignorance, lost at sea, hopelessly lost at sea, with only our mind to guide us. God forbid, what a terrible thought. Or do we see the sea of multiplicity and relativity in the context of a background of absolute confidence, in an absolute principle that never changes, and that is always eternal and indestructible? So the awakening to enlightened awareness would afford us that second choice. And now we are bearing witness to the sea of relativity, where everything's changing all the time. We can't be sure of everything. But there's a background. And then this background is a singularity that is absolutely solid and totally indestructible, and ungraspable and unknowable by the mind, and uncorruptible. And that, in the end, is where our spiritual self-confidence comes from. Is knowing that, seeing that, feeling that every day. So just to finish and to repeat what I've said many times already, we want to be aware of the dangers and the temptations of absolutism in any shape or any form that it takes. About yourself, about another person, about your group, about another group, about a way of thinking, about interpretive frameworks. Beware of absolutism. And to repeat what I've already said, absolutism makes us feel powerful, makes us feel strong or stronger, makes us feel like we're right. And when we feel like we're right, we feel superior. And that is very tempting for the ego, let me tell you. So we want to be more interested in seeing things as clearly as we can. We want to become more interested in clear perception than we are in being right. Good luck. If we are weak-minded and we're we easily succumb to the whims of our ego, we're going to always be more interested in being right when we aren't seeing the truth. And to repeat what I was saying a few minutes ago, if we want to have a closer access to truth in any form, it requires us to embrace more and more insecurity, which means experiencing the insecurity of not being sure. I think I'm seeing clearly, but I don't really know. I think I'm seeing clearly, but I'm not sure. Can you bear it? And we bear the insecurity of not being sure, not losing our confidence. And you can see why we need a lot of spiritual practice, and we need a lot of spiritual experience and a lot of higher development to get to that point where we can straddle both of those boats at the same time without slipping and falling and drowning. It's so easy to get this wrong. Difficult to get it right, and it's impossible to get it perfectly right. But what I hope you all will appreciate is the paradox, which is the nature of the challenge here for all of us. So in the teaching of evolutionary enlightenment, I have been advocating for many years that in relationship to everything I've been speaking about tonight about absolute versus absolutism, in my teaching, I have been advocating that this is the safest meta position for all of us to take in relationship to the totality of the experience of human consciousness and cognition is the inner position would be one of I don't know. We want to take the inner position of the meta position being I don't know in relationship to anything. I don't know, but I want to know. And if we can hold that dynamic tension between not knowing and wanting to know, it can help us to not make as many mistakes as we might otherwise make about being too sure of anything. I don't know, but I want to know. So the not knowing sets us free from fixed positions. Not knowing sets us free from all fixed positions related to history or to ignorance or to anything else. Not knowing sets us free again and again and again and again and again. Not knowing sets us free over and over again. And wanting to know is a place of awakened innocence and inspired interest in what's true. But it should be a freshly awakened, innocent, inspired interest in what's true, uncorrupted by knowing better or by past experiences. So I don't know, but I want to know. Will keep us in good shape, philosophically and spiritually, if we can put it into practice authentically. But it's a delicate business because the ego, the small self, in enlightenment circles, what the people call the false self, the small self, the frontal self, is very invested in the way that it sees reality. So the position of not knowing but wanting to know is very difficult for the ego to pull off. Because the ego is terrified of being wrong. And, and what's worse for the ego is not being wrong, but being seen by others as being wrong. Oh boy. So it's better to be seen as being right. From the ego's position, it's better. The ego would prefer to be seen as being right, even if you know secretly that you're wrong. So not knowing and wanting to know puts us in a very spiritually positive, spiritually hopeful position in relationship to all of our experience. We have the mettle to pull it off. This will keep us young, spiritually young, and keep us connected to our own soul's uncorrupted innocence, and will keep us connected to our capacity for growth, continued growth and development. Even as we age and get more mature, we can still be young, spiritually and vibrant. Maybe much more than younger people who can be very absolutist and overconfident in their opinions and beliefs. So I've noticed. It's amazing how sure of ourselves we can be when we have very little life experience. How much can anybody know by the time they get to be 25? Not that much. We haven't had enough life experience to be too sure of anything. So I don't know, but I want to know is the meta position that we want to learn to cultivate and put into practice. So and you don't need any help to do that. You just need to, you can do it on your own. I don't already know, but I want to know. And you see, even if you say to yourself, I don't already know, it opens up all possibilities in 1 second. I don't already know. It could be in relationship to yourself, in relationship to others, in relationship to ideas, to things that have happened in reality, things that you've thought about in the future. I don't know, but I want to know. It opens everything up. And all things become possible in a context that's very positive and hopeful. And in light of everything that I've been sharing with you in this teaching, it's very much in alignment with something I've been repeating almost every time I've been teaching as of late, which is that we can, along similar lines, we can experience perfection, but we can never be perfection, which is the same thought. We can experience perfection, and the experience of perfection awakens us to a capacity for spiritual self-confidence that can be indestructible, profound and powerful and liberating. But we can never be that perfection. You can experience that perfection, we can experience perfection, we'll never be able to be it. Which is kind of an unbearable truth, because the experience of perfection is the experience of that which is absolute. But in terms of being human, body, mind, soul, and personality, it's all a relative context. And the body, mind, soul, and personality can never be perfect. Too bad. Too bad. I'm sorry to disappoint anybody. That crack you see in the mirror really is there. Too bad. But but to me, the paradox and the tension between being able to experience perfection, which is the promise of liberation, and then the impossibility of being perfection, which is the reality of this relative absolute distinction. I find that paradox endlessly compelling, fascinating, and interesting, and challenging. It's really the challenge of being a human, challenge of being an awakened human being, an enlightened human being, is dealing with that paradox and that unbridgeable leap between relative and absolute. And just to finish, to repeat what I said earlier, once you've awakened to absolute reality and awakened to the mind of enlightenment or enlightened awareness, as I said at the beginning of the talk, we can't stop talking about it, we can't stop thinking about it, we can't stop speaking about it, because we've been bitten by the absolute, and she has infected our soul, so we can't escape from her. And therefore we always already know that she's more real than anything else could ever appear to be. And if that's the case, we can't help but bear witness to her presence here in this world. She wants us to bear witness because, from her point of view, there's so many souls that have not realized who she is, and that she's always here. So if that's something we have realized and awakened to ourselves, it's something we have to learn, we have to be willing to bear witness to in the face of a disbelieving world. And the disbelieving world these days, it's made up of some very smart people. So this paradox that I've been speaking about is the whole enchilada when you wake up. And then I'm going to finish, which otherwise I just keep babbling about this stuff. But if you look at it, the dangers lie on either side of either side of the equation. There are some people who awaken to enlightened awareness, to the absolute, and then from that point of view, they deny that relative reality exists at all, and they're wrong from my point of view, because relative reality, even though it's only relatively real, it definitely exists. And if it definitely exists, then we have to do business with it. We have to engage with it, not pretend it doesn't exist, not try to not ignore it, because you can't ignore something that's real, even if it's only relatively real. So some people who are intensely awake to the absolute are in denial of relative reality, and relative reality can't be avoided or denied since it really does exist. And on the other side of the equation, we have relativists who say everything's relative and there's nothing absolute. And they're equally wrong and equally deluded and equally misguided from my point of view. So we want to hold these two in balance. We want to embrace the paradox with as much elegance, sophistication, and intelligence and sensitivity as possible. Not an easy thing to do. Not an easy thing to do. But that's the task at hand and the goal to be accomplished and achieved every day by all of us who are sincere about all this, because it's very delicate. What could be more delicate than a paradox like this? I can't think of anything.